Erev Tov. We're down to the last four parshiot, Torah portions of the year and of the book of Deuteronomy. And this Shabbos, we have a double portion, Nitzavim and Vayeilech. They're doubled up because of the way the year works out. We've got 54 portions in the Torah, and some years we have a leap month. We need to have more portions. Some years we don't have a leap month, and we need to squeeze them in, so we double up some portions. This is one of those. Nitzavim, chapter 29, page 1165 in the Chumash, begins the following way. You stand this day, all of you, before the Lord your God, your tribal heads, your elders, your officials, all the men of Israel, your children, your wives, even the stranger within your camp, from wood chopper to water drawer, to enter into the covenant of the Lord your God. These are among the last words of Moses to the Jewish people, and he gathers them all and he tells them, here you are all standing before God to enter into this covenant. So here's how I imagine the scene of Moses having gathered all of the people. Remember, according to the Torah's account, there were 600,000 men over the age of 20, probably an equal amount of women, probably double, triple that in terms of children. We're dealing with, if you believe the Torah, we're dealing with at least a couple of million people. And apparently Moses gathered them all, and he wants to have his final words with them. I'm imagining not so much what Moses was trying to say as what the people must have been thinking with that kind of crowd and a little old man, 120 years old, without microphones, trying to speak to all of them. Here's what I figured happened. What's he saying? I don't know. I can't hear a thing. There must be more than 2 million of us standing here. And he's an old man. How does he expect to be heard by all of us? Would you people stop talking? I'm trying to listen. I can't hear a thing. That's what we're saying. Shh, quiet already. Lady, can you quiet down that baby? He's hungry. So go back to your tent and feed him. Moses said we all had to be here. Will you shut up? Maybe the people up closer can hear what he's saying. Ask somebody. Excuse me, what did he say? I think I heard something about wood chopping. Wood chopping? Why on earth would he gather everyone together to talk about chopping wood? No, I think he's talking about the brit. You mean circumcision? No, not that brit. The covenant between God and the Israelites. What about it? I think he wants us to accept it. How do we do that? Sign our names? Swear an oath? Isn't that what the brit of circumcision was all about? A sign of our covenant with God? Wouldn't it have made more sense for him to speak to one tribe at a time? Maybe then he might have been heard. Maybe he wanted to make the point that we're all one people. Here's an idea. What if he had people standing every 20 rows who then repeated what the guy in front of him said? Here's what he should have done. Take a piece of parchment, roll it up, and then speak through one end. It makes his words louder. Not loud enough for 2 million people to hear. But at least it's better than what he's doing now. Quiet! So, as is probably always the case, Jews have a difficulty just being quiet and listening, and instead have to criticize, look at the way he's doing this, couldn't he have done a better idea? I could have come up with something better than what he's doing. And in the meantime, they probably missed the whole point of what Moses was trying to say. It raises the whole question of the idea of how did a leader of hundreds, thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, how did the leader communicate before there were texting on your cell phone or before there was microphones and amplifiers? And how exactly did people communicate to large groups? Was it through just the leaders, and then the leaders communicated, to smaller groups? Hard to know. Maybe that accounts for some of the mistakes, repetitions, inconsistencies, difficulties that we have with some of the text. Maybe people just couldn't hear exactly what was going on. So from 29, Torah moves on to chapter 30 of Deuteronomy. And here we have a very famous line where in verse 12, continuing, Moses had gathered the people and he tells them, follow the Torah. And he tells them also, listen, don't complain that we can't do it, it's too difficult, it's too complicated. He says it's not. And in verse 12, he says, it is not in the heavens that you should say, who among us can go up to the heavens and get it for us and impart it to us, that we may observe it. Neither is it beyond the sea that you should say, who among us can cross to the other side of the sea and get it for us and impart it to us, that we may observe it. No, the thing is very close to you, in your mouth and in your heart, to observe it. So again, one of the last things Moses tells the people is, here's the Torah, you're expected to observe it, obey it, do it, follow it, and don't complain that it's too difficult, can't be done, can't be understood. Moses says it's not up in heaven. And by that, he simply means too high, too lofty, too complex, too, whatever for you. Okay, so I wanted to take that verse, the idea, it's not in the heavens, neither is it beyond the sea, and see what other possibilities this could have. Why do I have to be the one to go back to Egypt and free the Israelites from slavery? Moses asked God at the burning bush. Why can't you do this on your own? You're God. And if not you, why me? Isn't there someone back there who can handle this? And God replied mysteriously, Lo bashamayim hi. The exodus from Egypt will not happen because of what is done in heaven. V'lo me'ever layam, nor will it be done by someone on the other side of the sea. You, Moses, will be the one to take my people out. Okay, so there we have Moses being told by God, it's not in heaven, meaning it's not up to God to do this. I need somebody down on earth, and you're my man. So that's one interpretation of the words, it's not in heaven. Here's another one. After crossing the Sea of Reeds, Miriam spoke to her brother, now that we're gone for good from Egypt, I feel terrible that we left our mother in a grave in that terrible place. We brought out Joseph's bones. Couldn't we have taken her remains with us as well? Moses put his hand on his sister's shoulder. Lo bashamayim he. Our mother's soul is not in heaven. V'lo me'ever layam. Nor is she back there in Egypt, on the other side of the sea. In this case, the Sea of Reeds. I believe that her spirit is with us wherever we go. This idea is a very important one to the Jewish people. Where are our people, where are our parents buried? And how could we ever leave a place where they are? You know, there are many Jews, even to this very day, who deem it an incredibly important mitzvah to be buried in Israel, for instance. So no matter where you die, the body has to be shipped in Israel, and they want burial only in Israel. Here we're being told, and notice what happens with the Hebrew grammar. Lo bashamayim he, it's not in heaven. The word he, there is no Hebrew word for it. Okay, everything has to be he or she. So the phrase, it is not in heaven, literally in Hebrew you have to say, she is not in heaven. And of course, the she that Moses and God meant in this chapter, she is not in heaven, meaning the Torah. It's not above you. It's not beyond you. She, the Torah, can be understood and observed. But Miriam, in this passage now, she says, no, it doesn't mean it, the Torah. It means she, our mother. So sister and brother, as they are leaving Egypt, say, we're taking Joseph with us. Why can't we take our mom, her bones, her grave, and bring it with us? Well, you'll remember 4 generations previous, Joseph caused all his brothers to swear an oath that when the time comes that we're going back to Canaan, swear that you'll take my bones back with you. Don't leave me here in Egypt. But nobody else made that oath or caused anybody to swear that oath. So Miriam says, we took Joseph, why can't we take mom? And Moses, I think, is almost saying, can you imagine if 2 million people each dug up their families and we had to transport all these bodies and all these remains and these bones with us? What would that have said about our ultimate priorities? Okay, there's a famous story in modern Israeli history. There were 2 great leaders on the left and on the right in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and beyond. On the left, of course, was David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel. And on the right was Zev Jabotinsky. Jabotinsky was the founder of revisionist Zionism, which later became the Cherut Party, which later became the Likud Party of Menachem Begin, and today of Benjamin Netanyahu. So, as it happened, in 1940, Zev Jabotinsky was in the Catskills. He had been brought over from Palestine to speak to revisionist campers, kids at a revisionist Zionist camp up in the Catskills. And he died of a heart attack. And initially, he was buried in New Montefiore Cemetery in Farmingdale. Well, when the State of Israel is founded in 1948, his family and his followers said, we would very much like to bring Zev Jabotinsky's remains to Israel and to be buried there. For decades, Jabotinsky and Ben-Gurion disliked each other intensely. They were opposite sides of the political spectrum. And Ben-Gurion, as great a man as he was, founder of the Jewish nation, could also be a very petty individual. And as prime minister, he refused the request. And his answer was, we don't need dead Jews, more dead Jews in Israel. And what happened eventually, when Ben-Gurion stepped out of office and somebody else stepped in as the next prime minister, one of the first things that was allowed was bringing Jabotinsky's body from Long Island to Israel. And by the way, if you go to Yad Vashem, one of the things that you're able to learn is that Jabotinsky is buried on a hill overlooking Yad Vashem, because it was Jabotinsky, more than anybody else, who in the late 20s, but especially during the 30s, told the Jews, especially in Poland, you got to get out. Terrible things are going to happen, right? And he, more than anyone else, foresaw the Holocaust and warned people about it. Not very many listened to him. So here you have this incredible symbol of the man who foresaw the Holocaust is buried on a hill overlooking Yad Vashem, which commemorates the 6 million who were killed. So here we have the story of Moses telling his sister, our mother is not there, right? Her body, her bones may be there, but our mother is really with us, okay? So we don't have to worry about dragging her bones wherever we are. And then finally, we see one more interpretation of it's not in heaven. As Moses prepared to say farewell to the Israelites, Joshua revealed his fears to his mentor. I've never seen God face to face as you have. I've never spoken to God on a mountaintop. What am I supposed to do when we are faced with a great challenge? How am I going to know what God wants me to do? Moses smiled at his successor. Lo b'shamayim hi. The answers to all your questions will not come from heaven, v'lo me'ever layam, nor will they be found with some prophet in a far-off place. They will be found in this scroll of the Torah and in your best attempt to apply the law to whatever situation you find yourself in. Be strong and have courage. So, lo b'shamayim hi, we see that Moses tells Joshua, don't worry about God, right? It's going to be on your head. Do the best you can, and that will be enough. If you recognize it, this last piece is sort of modeled on the very famous story of Rabbi Joshua and Rabbi Eliezer and their debate about whether a certain oven was kosher or not kosher. Rabbi Eliezer had all these miraculous natural events take place, events of nature take place to prove that he was right. And finally, he has God himself speak from heaven and tell the other rabbis, Rabbi Eliezer is correct. And Rabbi Joshua says, lo b'shamayim hi, that once God gave us the Torah, it's ours. We do what we think is right. We don't listen to God anymore. So this last piece is sort of modeled on that famous Talmudic story. Now, finally, one more piece. We go to chapter 31, and we see on page 1174, chapter 31, verses 10, 11, and 12. Here's what it says. Every seventh year, the year set for remission at the Feast of Booths. So just a word about that. There was to be a sabbatical year every seventh year. What happened? If people owed money, then by the seventh year, every seventh year, all debts were canceled. It's like they wiped the slate clean and everybody could start out fresh. So that took place in the seventh year, and they blew the shofar at Sukkot to announce the seventh year is now begun, and all debts are hereby canceled. When all of Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God in the place that he will choose, you shall read this Torah aloud in the presence of all Israel. Gather the people, men, women, and children, and the strangers in your communities, that they may hear and so learn to revere the Lord your God, and to observe faithfully every word of this Torah. So not only was this seventh year a time for the remission of debts, it was also a time for gathering all the people together. Remember, it was Sukkot, so people were going to come to Jerusalem anyway for a pilgrimage festival. And while they were there, not every year at Sukkot, but every seventh year, right, what was going to happen? The entire Torah would be read to the people from start to finish. This was an opportunity of adult education, of teaching all the people who otherwise didn't have books, didn't have schools, didn't have classes. The idea was that you bring them together, remind them of what's in the Torah by reading it aloud to all the people. Joshua scratched his head. Is Moses really serious about this idea that once every 7 years we read the entire Torah out loud to all the people? Even if everyone showed up and paid careful attention, would they really remember everything they heard over the course of the next 7 years? And what exactly does he mean by Torah? Joshua asked himself. I've done the math. If we're talking about the entire Torah scroll, Genesis through Deuteronomy, there are 187 chapters in the book, and on average, it takes about 6 minutes to read a chapter out loud. That comes to over 1,100 minutes, which is a little more than 18 hours. He can't be serious. You're going to keep the entire nation, including little children and hormonal teenagers, during the Sukkot pilgrimage for almost an entire day, listening to people read and read and read? On the other hand, if what Moses had in mind when he said Torah was just the book of Deuteronomy, then we're talking about 34 chapters at 6 minutes a chapter, which comes to almost 3.5 hours. Doable, but certainly not optimal. I would say that hearing the Torah read once a year is much better than once every 7 years. But even then, it's still a problem to have people standing there for so many hours trying to absorb it all. What if we were to read a small portion of the Torah every week, either on market days or on Shabbat? Maybe we begin and end the yearly cycle around Sukkot. That would mean dividing up the Torah into about 50 separate portions. The problem is that most people only come to the tabernacle 3 times a year, if that. Maybe the answer is to have them show up in their towns on a weekly basis. But then we'd need hundreds of houses of assembly, each one with its own Torah scroll. It's all very complicated. I need to think some more about this at another time. For now, there's more pressing problems as we prepare to cross the Jordan. So ultimately, this law or tradition of reading the whole Torah, whatever that means, once every 7 years, not done, right? That's pretty much gone by the wayside. And what initially took place was that in Palestine, the land of Israel, they read the Torah on a triennial cycle, meaning not the way we do it, 1/3 of each portion. What they did is that they read 1/3 of the portion of Shemot, and then the next week, the second third of the portion of Shemot, and then the third week, the third third of Shemot. So it took them 3 weeks to read one Torah portion, which meant that they were able to read the entire Torah in about 1.5 years. Later, the Babylonian Jewish community made a change. They said this should be done within 1 year, and so they created the cycle that most of us grew up with, which is you read the portion of Shemot this week, and then next week you read the portion of Vayeilech, and et cetera, et cetera. And then this way you were able to finish the entire Torah in about 1 year's time. What we think happened was that sometime in the 5th century BCE, maybe around the year 444 BCE, Ezra came from Babylonia with the Jews who returned from exile. And as they began to settle and rebuild the land of Israel and the temple, Ezra came up with the idea that the Torah should be read 3 times a week, on Mondays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. Where did they come up with Monday and Thursday? It wasn't anything that was sacred or holy about those days. It was that in that time and place, Monday and Thursday happened to be the market days. In other words, people would work at their farms and collect whatever produce, and they would go to market on twice a week, Monday and Thursday, to sell whatever they needed to sell, to buy whatever they needed to buy. So that's where we get the idea of we read on Monday morning a portion, we read on Thursday morning a portion, even though today that's got nothing to do with these flea markets that used to take place with these market days. And of course, after the temple was destroyed, synagogues began to take their place in each local community. And one of the things that they did, besides prayer, was reading of the Torah, bringing the people together to read the Torah. So we see this transition from once every 7 years to 3 times a week, and then in the course of either 1.5 years or 1 year, the Torah was completed. So we get that idea from this portion, and Joshua questioning, was this really a good idea, a great pedagogic idea? Clearly, is this what Moses wanted, what God intended? Somewhere along the way, we dropped the idea. So it never caught on, wasn't very effective, was very difficult to carry out. And it may very well have been that we've come up with a better plan, reading a portion every Shabbos, which brings together our community. So we now come to the Haftarah. Haftarah for Nitzavim is going to be the seventh Haftarah of Consolation. Haftarah Shvi'it Denechemta. And so we've been going through this cycle, which started the week after Tisha B'Av and continues through this coming week, which will lead us to the week after. Will be on that Shabbos, we have Rosh Hashanah. So we've had 7 weeks now going from destruction to new beginnings. And all of these Haftarot are of Nechemta, the Aramaic word for the Hebrew Nechama, same word as Menachem, the name, or Nachum, which means comforter, the one who brings consolation or comfort to you. All of these Haftarot are from the prophet Isaiah, who lived during this time around 550 BCE. So, following with my theory that these were all these highfalutin speeches were really best understood as street theater, here's how I imagine this Haftarah really happening. It was a Tuesday when the men returned from work, their clothing stained with sweat and dirt. They were met at their doors by their wives, whose garments were also dirty, covered with flour and other foods they had spent the day preparing in their kitchens. But walking down the street was the prophet, adorned in his finest garments, wearing an expensive turban on his head. So on a work day, people are dressed for work, they're all dirty, and it's precisely on that day that the prophet draws attention to himself by wearing something that nobody else is wearing, his Shabbos finery or his holiday clothes. "What are you all dressed up for, prophet?" they asked. "I'm going to a wedding," he replied. "A wedding? Who's getting married?" "Hadn't you heard?" the prophet asked. "God is the bridegroom, and he is marrying Israel, the most beautiful of brides. Come, you are all invited to the celebration. And what a celebration it will be. God will rejoice over Israel just like a bridegroom rejoices over his bride. Watchmen will be on the walls of the city guarding us. Rocks will be cleared from the road. New roads will be paved for all the guests. Banners will be set up within Jerusalem that proclaim a city not forsaken." Okay, and we see that one of the lines here is, "Nevermore shall you be called forsaken, nor shall your land be called desolate. But you shall be called, I delight in her, and your land espoused," or engaged, meaning as a youth espouses a maiden, your sons shall espouse you. And then we see the very famous line, "Yasis alayich Elohayich," that your God will rejoice over you, Kimsos Chatan al Kala, a very famous wedding song today, but it comes from this Haftarah. And the basis of it is the notion, this radical idea, that God is the groom and the Jews are the bride. Not how we often think about God. God is the king, God is the judge, but as the bridegroom, not so much. And Isaiah brings that marvelous, radical image of Jews and God married together, an intimate, loving relationship. So that was on Tuesday in this small town. And by pretending to be going to a wedding, people say, "Who's getting married?" And the answer is God and the Jews. Okay, so the point is made but he needs to dress up in costume in order to get their attention. The meaning here is the people thought God hates us, God punished us, God exiled us, God is finished with us. And instead, Isaiah comes back with this, no, God is marrying us. That's how much God loves us. Okay, but then how do you explain what just took place? Why were we defeated? Why were we exiled? The answer is that there was a relationship, and God was angry because we strayed, but God, all is forgiven. God is taking us back. The wedding is back on, right? And that was the message to the people. So that was on Tuesday. Here's Wednesday. The next day, a Wednesday, the prophet appeared again, still wearing his finest clothing. But on this day, the clothes were all stained the color of blood. Why is your clothing so red? The people asked. I have come from Edom, where I have finished treading grapes in wrath. Imagine people who were vintners. So you have your vines, you collect the grapes. What do you do with the grapes? You make wine. How do you do that? You get a large circular kind of area. You throw all the grapes in, and then people jumped in, took off your sandals, and you squished the grapes. Now, in this giant contraption, there was, of course, a hole, and as the grapes oozed their juice, the juice went down into the hole, was collected, maybe there was a spigot, and they were able to take away the juice, which would then be fermented into wine. But imagine that when the people were treading the grapes, the truth of the matter is their cloaks, their clothing was stained with the grapes, right? And you say, why is your clothes all reddish? So instead of, well, because I was squishing grapes and the red juice got on the hem of my clothing. That's the obvious answer and the simple answer. But Isaiah comes up with a different answer. He says, I am God, and the grapes represent our enemies, the people who did all these terrible things to us. And I, God, squished the enemy until they were bloodied. And so I'm covered with the blood of the enemies of the Jewish people. Where I have finished treading grapes in wrath. See how I have trampled in anger our enemies, how I have trodden in rage those who would harm us. When we were in terrible straits, God was troubled along with us. In his mercy and kindness, he came to our defense. He has become our deliverer. Thus said God, for the sake of Zion, I will not be silent. For the sake of Jerusalem, I will not be still. So, going back to the actual words of the Haftarah, it says, chapter 63, verse 2, why is your clothing so red, your garments like his who treads grape? And the answer of God is, I trod out a vintage alone. Of the peoples no man was with me. I trod them down in my anger, trampled them in my rage. Their lifeblood bespattered my garments, and all my clothing was stained. For I had planned a day of vengeance, and my year of redemption arrived. This now becomes the source of the American song, right? The Grapes of Wrath, okay? And this is where Steinbeck gets his title of his novel from the American song, I'm trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath, right? That comes from this Haftarah, this idea. And of course, the song is that in the Civil War, the Union, this was in effect God trampling down the people who would enslave another people, who would try to break apart our nation. So that's the basis of the Haftarah. Haftarah leads to that Civil War hymn that leads to Steinbeck's famous novel. So we see how all these things are connected and intertwined.